Hi learners, myself Dr. Neeru Rani, Assistant Professor, Department of Education, MD University Northern. Today our topic is variables and their classification. The term variable refers to a property or characteristic whereby the members of a group or set differ one from another. The members of a group may be individuals and may be found to differ in sex, eye, color, intelligence, auditory acuity, reaction time to a stimulus, attitude towards a political issue, anxiety, learning ability, memory, capacity, height, weight, body surface area, heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar level, and many other ways. Such properties are variables. In other words, a variable is any property or characteristics of some events, object, or person that may have different values at different times depending on the conditions. In contrast, the term constant refers to a property whereby the members of a group do not differ from one another. A variable may vary in two ways. First is spatial variation and second is temporal variation. When a variable varies from individual to individual, place to place, organ to organ at any given time, it is known spatial variation. On the other hand, when a variable varies in the same individual at different times, it is called temporal variation. The particular values of a variable are referred to as variates or variate values. The term variable refers to attributes or qualities which exhibit differences in magnitude and which vary along some dimensions. The concept of a variable doesn't imply that each observation must differ from all others. All that is necessary is the possibility of difference. Now, the classification of the variables. The variables can be classified in two ways. First one is continuous and discontinuous variable, and second classification is independent and dependent variables. Now, what is a continuous variable? Continuous variable form a continuous series. A series is said to be continuous when it is capable of any degree of subdivision and in practice shows no real gaps. Therefore, a variable is said to be continuous when it passes from one value to the next by indefinitely small changes. Height, weight, length, temperature, and so on are examples of such variables. For example, in measuring height, we can get measurement in meters capable of being broken into centimeters, millimeters, etc. with a greater degree of precision. Here, scores and measurements concerning height exhibit no real gaps. When the given range, any score, integral or fractional, may exist and have meaning. The same is true for weight and other measures of physical as well as mental traits, either scores on an intelligence or achievement test. Now, discontinuous or discrete variables, on the other hand, can take on only certain values. A series is said to be discontinuous or discrete when it exhibits real gaps. Consequently, a variable is said to be discontinuous or discrete when there are real gaps between one value and the next. The data regarding such variables can be expressed in whole units or numbers. The number of children in a family, the number of cycles passing a crossing during a certain period of time, and so on. With the above description of continuous and discontinuous variables or series, the students may now clearly visualize that most of the variables deal with in education, psychology and sociology are continuous or may be normally treated as continuous rather than discontinuous or discrete. The distinction between continuous and discontinuous variables is often only a theoretical one, and in practice, because of lack of suitable measuring instruments, many continuous variables have to be assigned whole number values. Intelligence quotient theoretically is a continuous variable, but in practice the tests used to measure it give whole numbers or discrete values. Because of certain problems in measuring on continuous scale, most variables are given discrete values. In order to interpret such values, account is taken of the mathematical true limits of the number. Now, what are the true limits of the number? For example, in a performance test, it was found that 10 students scored 90. Does this really mean that all are equal in performance? All being alike in ability is not possible. It is more likely that some scored just below 90 and some scored just above 90. but the measuring instrument was not sophisticated enough to detect the differences. To overcome this problem, number 90 is said to have limits ranging from 89.5 to 90.5, and any score between these limits are given the score 90. The score is never a point on the scale, but it occupies an interval from 0.5 unit below to 0.5 unit above its face value, or the true limits of a number are found out by subtracting 0.5 from the number and by adding 0.5 into the number, and it is not a point, it is an interval. Now the second classification of the variables is independent variable and dependent variable. A variable is not only something that we measure, but also something that we can manipulate and something we can control for. An independent variable, sometimes called an experimental or predictor variable, is a variable that is being manipulated in an experiment in order to observe the effect on a dependent variable. Sometimes called an outcome variable. For example, suppose that some students were administered a test and their scoring was done. Some students performed better than others. Why these differences exist in the performance of the students? The reason may be that some students spend more time in studies, or some students are naturally more intelligent than others. In this situation, the effect of time spent on studies and intelligence on performance of students can be measured. In this study, dependent variable is test marks and independent variables are time spent in studies and intelligence. In an experiment or study, the variable whose changes are assessed or measured is called the dependent variable in that experiment. On the contrary, the variables whose effect on the dependent variables are being investigated are called the independent variables in the experiment. Thus, the changes in dependent variables may be considered to be dependent on the changes of the independent variable. The relationship between independent and dependent variables is the relationship between cause and effect, with the independent variable being the cause and dependent variable being the effect. In short, we can say that the independent variable in an experiment is the variable that is systematically manipulated by the investigator. The dependent variable in an experiment is the variable that the investigator measures to determine the effect of the independent variable. In behavioral sciences, the dependent variable is generally called the criterion variable, whereas the dependent variable is called the predictor or predictor variable. For example, if we want to assess the effects of different periods of practice on the learning performance of the subjects in an experiment, then learning performance is the dependent variable on criterion, while the periods of practice constitute the different variables or the predictor. Now this was about the variables, as these are very important part of statistics, because in statistics, to go further we should know such type of terms. Thank you very much.